All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick Strength and Power. So in this video, we're going to do a complete biography on who some consider to be the greatest bodybuilder of all time, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Now, as a bodybuilder, Arnold Schwarzenegger was a 3-time pro Mr. Universe, a 7-time Mr. Olympia. He would go on to become the 38th governor of California, a movie star with a net worth of over $400 million. He would serve as the chair of the President's Council of Physical Fitness and Sports from 1990 to 1993, and he became one of the biggest bodybuilding promoters of all time when he started the Arnold Schwarzenegger Classic in 1989, which is really the only bodybuilding competition to this day that could rival the title of Mr. Olympia. So Arnold Schwarzenegger was born on July 30th, 1947, near Graz, Austria. His father was the chief of police there, and his father also voluntarily joined the Nazi Party during World War II. Arnold would go on to say later in life that he didn't have an easy childhood and his father was pretty rough on him, and would essentially say that he was abused by his father physically. However, his father would be the one that inspired him to start weight training at the age of 15 when he picked up his first barbell set back in 1960. So if you fast forward to 1965, Arnold Schwarzenegger was forced to serve in the Austrian army. It was just a duty that was required of everybody over the age of 18 at that point in time. Now, also in 1965, Arnold would compete in the Junior Mr. Europe competition, and this would be the first bodybuilding competition that he would win. But he would win it at a cost, because to compete in that competition, he actually went AWOL from the military to compete. Then he served a week in military prison as a result of that. So if you fast forward to Arnold Schwarzenegger's first ever Mr. Universe competition in 1966, this would be the first of 3 times that Arnold would be defeated on a bodybuilding stage. So in 1966, he was runner-up at that year's Mr. Universe, taking second to a bodybuilder by the name of Chet Yorton, who to this day claims he was a lifetime natural bodybuilder. Now, in addition to Chet Yorton, as we know, Arnold would go on to be defeated by Frank Zane at the Mr. Universe competition in 1968, and then by Sergio Oliva at the Mr. Olympia in 1969. So even though Arnold didn't win the 1966 Mr. Universe, this was still a very critical moment for Arnold Schwarzenegger's bodybuilding career. It was at this 1966 Universe competition that Arnold was discovered by a man by the name of Wag Bennett, who was actually a judge at that year's Mr. Universe. So while a lot of credit goes to Joe Weider for being the guy that quote-unquote discovered Arnold, Wag Bennett was really the first guy that noticed the potential that Arnold had at that 1966 Mr. Universe and invited Arnold to come back to London with him and stay with him and train him for the next year's Mr. Universe competition in 1967, which Arnold would actually go on to win due to Wag Bennett's training. And that Universe win would make Arnold the youngest ever at that time to win the Mr. Universe title at the age of 20 years old. So talking about Wag Bennett, I want to talk about another guy that really had a major influence on Arnold Schwarzenegger's career and really influenced introducing him to Joe Weider. So this man's name was Albert Buzek. So we talked earlier about that 1965 Junior Mr. Europe competition that Arnold competed in. So the promoter of that show was a man named Albert Buzek, and Albert Buzek was a personal friend of Joe Weider. So Albert Buzek took immediate notice of Arnold after that 1965 competition. He took Arnold out to dinner after that show, and they talked about his hopes and dreams of moving to America and becoming this big bodybuilding star. Then in 1966, Arnold went on to compete in that Mr. Universe competition, and that's where Albert Buzek told Joe Weider about Arnold after that Universe second place finish. So Albert Buzek was constantly in Joe Weider's ear telling him about this great guy from Europe, this Arnold Schwarzenegger that had all this potential in bodybuilding. And even in 1967, when Arnold would win that Mr. Universe, Joe Weider still hadn't made the offer yet to bring Arnold over to the United States. So after that 1967 Universe win, Albert Buzek owned a magazine called the Sport Review magazine, and he would put Arnold on the cover of that magazine, and shortly after that, him and Joe Weider would have a sit-down conversation in 1968 in Dusseldorf, Germany, discussing the possibility of bringing Arnold over to the United States. So after that sit-down, Joe Weider decided to offer Arnold a paid invitation, a paid trip to the 1968 IFBB Mr. Universe competition, which was held in Miami, Florida. So history will show that Arnold actually lost that 1968 Mr. Universe in Miami, Florida, and he lost it to Frank Zane. But it was that loss, actually, that got Joe Weider's attention, because Arnold came in very big, very full, but the conditioning wasn't quite there. He hadn't really refined himself yet, but Frank Zane obviously is known for coming in very ripped and very shredded, and that's how Frank Zane won. So upon seeing this massive Arnold Schwarzenegger, Joe Weider decided, okay, if we refine this guy, we show this guy how to get lean and get into his best shape, this guy has some serious potential. So that's actually what caused Joe Weider to take Arnold under his wing, was seeing him lose to Frank Zane and knowing that Arnold could do so much better. So after that 68 universe, Joe Weider offered Arnold his first contract and invited him to come live in California and begin training there at Gold's Gym Venice and living in America full time. So after moving to America, Arnold would go on to win the 1969 Mr. Universe and also the 1969 NABBA Mr. Universe. And then he would go on to compete at the 1969 Mr. Olympia, his Olympia debut, which was held in New York. And as history will show, he took second to Sergio Oliva, who was the reigning Mr. Olympia at that time. But Arnold would come back in 1970 to take the victory. Now, the interesting thing about that was also in 1970, he would go to compete at the Mr. World competition, the AAU Mr. World. So not an IFBB show. So outside of the IFBB, him and Sergio would go head-to-head at this Mr. World, and he would actually defeat Sergio Oliva for the first time prior to the Mr. Olympia, obviously generating a lot of hype and a lot of excitement going into that 1970 Olympia, that the Olympia champion had been defeated before the Olympia. So Arnold would come back to New York at the 1970 Mr. Olympia and defeat Frank Zane and begin his reign as seven-time Mr. Olympia. So the following year in 1971, that would be where Arnold Schwarzenegger was the only competitor at the Mr. Olympia. Now, 1971 was the year that the IFBB introduced their non-sanctioned policy into bodybuilding. So the IFBB essentially is the pro bodybuilding organization founded by Joe Weider. Now, at that time, there were a couple rival bodybuilding federations, such as NABBA. As I mentioned earlier, there was an IFBB Mr. Universe and a NABBA Mr. Universe. So at the time, the NABBA Mr. Universe was really one of the highest titles you could win as a bodybuilder. And Joe Weider was really looking to monopolize the IFBB and make it really the only game in town in terms of being the best place to compete. He wanted the Mr. Olympia to be the most prized title in bodybuilding. So the way he did that was in 1971. He said, okay, if you're an IFBB bodybuilder and you go over and compete in NABBA, you're going to be disqualified from competing at my Mr. Olympia. So at the 1971 Olympia, Sergio Oliva and Franco Colombo were both scheduled to compete, but they were both disqualified for competing in rival organizations. But interestingly enough, they were both still allowed to guest pose at that 1971 Mr. Olympia. So in 1972, Sergio Oliva would be allowed back to the Mr. Olympia competition, and him and Arnold would go head-to-head for the final time, and Arnold would come out on top, winning that show. And Sergio Oliva was actually so disgruntled that he took second after this show. He claimed the competition was rigged, and he would not return to the Mr. Olympia until almost a decade later, when Arnold was done competing. So, of course, Arnold would go on to win the 73, 74, and 75 Mr. Olympias. And as many of you know, the 75 Mr. Olympia was the Olympia that was documented in the docudrama Pumping Iron, which was released in 1977. Now, many people think that Pumping Iron was actually Arnold's first film, but in fact, it wasn't. There was a film prior to that in 1976 called Stay Hungry, which also starred Jeff Bridges, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was like a secondary character in that movie. But even before Stay Hungry, Arnold actually did have a movie role in 1969 as Hercules. Now, the interesting thing about that Hercules movie role is it was given away as a prize for winning that 1969 Mr. Universe. Now, even though Arnold's voice was dubbed over for the majority of the movie because of his accent, it was still a major movie role for a young Arnold Schwarzenegger that really propelled his career as a possible film star. So during that 1975 Mr. Olympia that was documented in Pumping Iron, during his victory speech after winning that Olympia, Arnold retired from bodybuilding and said he was going to pursue his career in Hollywood. But as we all know, Arnold would be back in 1980 to do the 1980 Mr. Olympia and get that seventh title, controversially, mind you. So the 1980 Mr. Olympia is widely considered to be one of the most controversial bodybuilding decisions in history due to the fact that Arnold claimed he only trained for 8 weeks for this show. And his training for that Olympia actually coincided with his training for his movie role in Conan the Barbarian, which would come out in 1982. Now let's talk about one of the main reasons why this decision was controversial. So after retiring as a bodybuilder in 1975, Arnold would go on to be a promoter of bodybuilding contests, specifically a promoter of the Mr. Olympia, which back in the late 70s was actually held in Columbus, Ohio, and Arnold co-promoted the Olympia with his business partner and associate Jim Lorimer. So for the 3 years prior to his comeback to the Olympia stage as a competitor, Arnold Schwarzenegger was actually one of the promoters of that very same competition. So many people thought the show was then rigged in his favor because obviously, being a promoter, he knew pretty much everybody involved with the Mr. Olympia. So Arnold would end up winning that 1980 Mr. Olympia, beating Chris Dickerson, who took second, and Frank Zane, who was the returning champion from 1979, would take third. Boyer Coe and Mike Menser would tie for fourth. And Menser ended up receiving fifth place as a result of that tie. And Mike Menser was arguably the most outspoken of how fixed this Olympia was and one of the most disappointed in that result. And he would go on to boycott the 1981 Mr. Olympia, but he was not alone in that decision. Boyer Coe and Roger Walker would also boycott the 1981 Mr. Olympia as a result of this show. Now, another interesting tidbit about this 1980 Mr. Olympia that speaks to the controversial nature of the result was that CBS actually came to this Olympia and filmed it for television. But after they saw the result, they thought it was so clearly controversial and so clearly rigged for Arnold, they ended up not airing it on TV. And that would be the last Mr. Olympia competition ever filmed by an American broadcast television network. So during the 80s, that would be Arnold's primary heyday as an action star in Hollywood, starring as Conan the Barbarian, The Terminator, Commando. He was in Predator. All the major movies that Arnold was in were primarily during the 80s. So fast forward to 1989. That's the year that Arnold Schwarzenegger decided to found the Arnold Sports Festival, or the Arnold Classic as we know it today. And the same person that he teamed up with to promote the Olympia back in the late 70s, Jim Lorimer, was the same person he teamed up with to found this Arnold Classic. So back in 1989, Arnold and Jim Lorimer made this decision on a handshake that they would promote this show, the Arnold Classic. It would be held in Columbus, Ohio, and it has been held there ever since for the past 30 years and has been one of the most popular and most successful bodybuilding competitions in history, further cementing Arnold Schwarzenegger's legacy as one of the greatest and most influential bodybuilders of all time. Now, it was 1 year after that first Arnold Classic that Arnold would begin his career as the chairman of the President's Council on Physical Fitness, and that would really begin his career in politics, and that would last from 1990 to 1993. Now, fast forward 10 years and several more action movies from that point, Arnold would become the 38th governor of California. He would serve 2 terms from January 2003 to January 3rd, 2011. Now, later that year in 2011, I think it was May of that year, Arnold and his wife, Maria Shriver, would go through their separation after 25 years of marriage. It was widely publicized on the news that Arnold Schwarzenegger had a child with their housekeeper while he and Maria Shriver were still married, so that was a major moment in Arnold's life. And then most recently, in 2018, Arnold Schwarzenegger underwent emergency open-heart surgery, and this was because he was born with a bicuspid aortic valve, which he had replaced back in 1997, but in March of 2018, he had to undergo emergency open-heart surgery to repair that. And now, at the age of 70 years old, Schwarzenegger is on the road to recovery, and he is doing well. So I hope you guys enjoyed that little mini documentary. Please give this video a thumbs up if you want to see more, and please subscribe to this channel if you want to see more videos just like this. Thank you guys for watching. Nick Strength and Power, signing out.